Story number 1.
The farmhouse belonged to my grandparents, and for most of my childhood, I associated it with warm summers, sweet corn, and early morning fog on the fields. It sat in a quiet stretch of Iowa farmland, 30 minutes from the nearest town. The nearest neighbor was a retired couple who lived almost a mile down a winding dirt road. The farmhouse had been built in the early 1900s, a modest two-story with chipped white paint, a rusting red barn out back, and a wraparound porch that creaked under even the lightest steps. I hadn't been there in nearly a decade when I returned in the fall of 2019, shortly after my grandfather passed. My grandmother had died years earlier, and the property had stood empty since. I was between jobs at the time, and my mother asked if I'd be willing to check in on the place, make sure no squatters had moved in, clean out some of the old rooms, maybe start prepping it to be sold. It was supposed to be a quiet, lonely sort of chore. What I found there still makes me question everything I understand about the world. The first day was uneventful. I arrived just before noon. The long gravel driveway was overgrown, and a deer bolted into the corn as I pulled up. Everything looked the same, just older and abandoned. A few shingles had blown off the roof. One of the porch railings was completely missing, and the grass was knee-high. I let myself in with the old brass key my mom had mailed me. The front door groaned open, and a cold, stagnant scent rushed out to meet me. Inside, the air was heavy with mildew and dust. Furniture was draped in white sheets. The clock on the wall had stopped at 11:47. The first strange thing happened that night. I'd brought a cot and sleeping bag, planning to sleep in the front room where I could prop open a window. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the stillness like a razor, short, sharp tapping sounds. They came from upstairs. I stayed still, ears straining. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like fingernails on wood. I told myself it was an animal. Maybe a raccoon had gotten into the attic. But then it stopped, and a moment later I heard footsteps. Light, measured steps, as if someone was walking barefoot across the upstairs hallway. I grabbed the flashlight and climbed the stairs slowly. The house was dead silent by the time I reached the top. I checked each bedroom, the old bathroom, even the narrow storage closet by the linen cabinet. Nothing. But as I turned to go back down, my flashlight flickered, just for a moment. When it came back on, I could have sworn I saw a shape at the end of the hallway. Short, hunched. It vanished when I blinked. I told myself I was tired, jet-lagged, imagination playing tricks. The second night was worse. I'd spent the day going through boxes in the barn, mostly old tools and mason jars. Around dusk, I came across a wooden crate nailed shut. Curious, I pried it open with a crowbar and found something that sent a chill through me. Children's toys. Not unusual in and of itself, my mother had grown up here. But these were old, like early 1900s, a cloth doll with button eyes, a wooden horse on wheels, a tarnished silver rattle. None of them looked like anything I remembered from visiting as a kid. That night, the noises started again. First the tapping, then the footsteps. But this time, I also heard whispering. It came from the hallway, low, like someone murmuring just below the threshold of hearing. I got up again and scanned the upper floor. Nothing. But when I came back down and passed the front room mirror, the same mirror my grandmother used to polish every Saturday, I saw something that made me stop cold. A handprint. It was small, too small to be mine, pressed right onto the glass, 5 delicate fingers as if a child had placed their hand there and never wiped it away. I slept with the light on after that. The next morning I called my mom. I tried to sound casual as I asked if she remembered anything weird happening at the farmhouse. She hesitated. "I used to have dreams," she said. "Bad ones, about a little boy. But your grandpa always told me it was just my imagination. You know how kids are, a boy?" I asked. She paused again. "Yeah. I used to see him sometimes, out in the barn, standing in the loft, or just watching from the corn. He never spoke, just stood there." My skin went cold. I didn't tell her what I'd been hearing. I didn't want to sound paranoid. But that night, something changed. Around 3 a.m., I woke up gasping for air. It felt like someone was sitting on my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My limbs were frozen, my lungs burning. And in the corner of the room, I saw him, a boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old. He stood just outside the glow of my flashlight, pale skin almost luminescent in the dark. His eyes were sunken, lips too thin, and his head tilted in a way that felt unnatural, curious, like he didn't understand what I was. Then he stepped forward. I blacked out. I woke up with scratches on my chest. Not long, deep ones, just small, deliberate lines, parallel, like tiny fingers had clawed at me. I packed up and drove into town that morning. There's a little historical society in Coon Rapids, about 30 minutes away. I asked about the farmhouse, who owned it before my grandparents, anything about local history. The old woman working the front desk looked surprised when I mentioned the address. That property used to be the Cleary place, she said. Long time ago, early 1900s. I asked what happened. She pulled out an old newspaper archive and pointed to a headline from 1911. Local boy missing. Cleary family search continues. The article was short. Apparently their only son, Thomas Cleary, vanished without a trace in September of that year. No body was ever found. The father, distraught, hanged himself in the barn the following winter. The mother was committed shortly after, raving about how Thomas still visited her at night. I left the archive room feeling like someone had dropped ice water down my back. That evening, I returned to the house. My plan was to grab my things, board up the front door, and leave for good. But when I walked into the front room, the mirror was shattered. The pieces were scattered across the floor in a perfect arc. In the center of the shards sat the cloth doll I'd found in the barn, its button eyes facing the ceiling. I never brought it inside. The doll was gone when I blinked again. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch, shotgun across my lap, trying to keep the shaking out of my hands. Around midnight, the temperature dropped fast, and the fog came in from the fields. That's when I heard the front door creak open behind me. I spun around. Nothing there. Then I heard it again. Tapping from the upstairs window. Then the whispering. Then a slow, deliberate knock on the front wall, 3 times. I ran to my truck and drove. Didn't stop for anything. I slept in the gas station parking lot 10 miles away. When I returned the next morning to board up the house, I found the front door closed and locked. A single word had been etched into the wood beneath the handle. Stay. I didn't. I told my mom I'd handled everything. We sold the place as is a few months later. The man who bought it said he planned to tear it down and rebuild. He lasted 6 days. When I asked why he was backing out of the sale, he just muttered, "I don't think that house wants to go." I haven't been back since. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear tapping on my bedroom window. I live on the 5th floor. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The first time I saw the farmhouse, it was buried in the middle of a pale brown field that rolled endlessly into the horizon. My wife, Claire, had found the listing through some obscure real estate blog focused on old, forgotten properties in the Midwest. The photos looked like they'd been taken with a disposable camera, but even through the grain and washed-out tones, the place looked beautiful. 2 stories, wraparound porch, detached barn, and over 40 acres of land. The price was absurdly low, $42,000 for everything. We'd just come off a miserable year in Chicago, layoffs, noise complaints from neighbors, and Claire's miscarriage in February. She'd grown quiet since then, retreating further into herself with every passing week. I think both of us thought this move could be some kind of reset. The place was in rural Iowa, about 3 hours outside Des Moines, way off the grid. We arrived on a bright Sunday afternoon in September. The air was warm, and crickets buzzed from every direction. The road ended a mile before the house, and we followed a dirt driveway that snaked between dead cornstalks and skeletal trees. The farmhouse sat slightly tilted on a small hill, flanked by a weather-beaten barn and a dried-up well near the front yard. Paint peeled from the wooden panels, but it looked structurally sound. The real estate agent was a middle-aged man named Don. He wore sunglasses the whole time, even indoors, kept looking at the corners of the rooms like he was expecting something to crawl out of them. "It's been vacant a few years," he said, hands in his pockets. "Previous owner passed. Family didn't want it. You'd be the first full-time residents in a long while." "Was it a farm?" Claire asked, her voice almost too soft to hear. "Sort of. Nobody ever had much luck with it. Ground's no good. Local soil reports say it's sour." Claire walked room to room slowly, her fingertips tracing the walls like she was reading Braille. I followed behind, already picturing the fixes I'd need to make. The house had a kind of damp, earthy smell, like it hadn't been truly empty, just waiting. We moved in 2 weeks later. The first few days were quiet, peaceful even. I started clearing out the barn while Claire worked on the house. She didn't say much, but she seemed lighter. She smiled more. She sang in the mornings. There was a rhythm to it all. I thought maybe we really could rebuild ourselves here. Then the noises started. At first, it was just scratching, light and sporadic. I figured we had mice in the walls, maybe squirrels in the attic. It was an old house after all. I set traps, checked the insulation, found nothing. Then came the knocking. Always at night. It would start faint, usually near the back door, sometimes the stairs. Never more than 3 knocks. Never frantic, just slow and deliberate, like someone gently testing the wood. I got up once at 2 a.m. when I heard it. Claire had already been awake, sitting upright in bed, staring toward the bedroom door. I asked her what was wrong. "Did you hear it?" she whispered. "Hear what?" "The crying," she said. I didn't hear anything then, just wind rustling the trees. But Claire insisted she'd been woken up by the sound of a child sobbing from somewhere inside the house. We searched the whole place. Nothing. No footprints, no evidence of break-ins. I told her it was probably a dream. She didn't argue, but that night, she slept with the light on. The days stayed normal enough. I built shelves. We repainted the living room. But at night, something shifted. The house grew heavy, like the air had thickened. The temperature dropped even when the heater was running. One morning, I woke up to find Claire standing at the kitchen window, unmoving. "What are you looking at?" I asked. "There's someone in the barn," she said. I rushed out there, armed with a crowbar. I searched every inch, rafters, hayloft, storage room. Nothing. No footprints. No signs anyone had been there. That night, I locked the barn from the outside and took the key upstairs. I didn't tell Claire, but I wedged a chair under the doorknob of our bedroom before we went to sleep. I dreamed that night. In the dream, I was walking down the hallway of our house, except it wasn't the same. The walls were damp. The wallpaper was dripping. At the end of the hall stood a man in overalls facing the wall. His head was cocked unnaturally to one side, like it had been dislocated. He started humming, something low and tuneless. I woke up gasping. Claire wasn't in bed. I found her in the hallway, standing outside the guest room, barefoot and blank-eyed. "Claire," I said. She didn't turn. She just whispered, "They keep saying the same thing. Over and over." "Who?" She finally looked at me. Her face was pale, and her lips trembled. "It's not our house." The guest room door creaked open. I swear to God I hadn't touched it. We started sleeping with the bedroom door locked. Claire stopped speaking much during the day. She would stare out windows, especially at dusk, and hum to herself. I'd hear her talking softly when she thought I wasn't around. Sometimes I'd catch snippets. They don't remember what happened. She never came back. It's still in the well. I went back to town and asked around. Most people just shrugged, said the place was old or bad land. But one old man, Charlie, leaned in close to me in the hardware store and said, "Your house used to belong to the Dietrichs. They lost their daughter out there, fell in the well. They say the mom went mad after that, killed the father, then herself." "When was that?" I asked. 1930s, I think. There have been others since then. That place always eats people. I tried not to think about it. But 2 nights later, I found Claire outside, in the middle of the field, barefoot and crying. The moon was nearly full, and her nightgown billowed in the wind. She was digging with her hands. "I saw her," she kept repeating. "She's in the ground." We left the next morning to stay in a motel in town. I told her we'd come back after we got some help. She didn't argue. She just stared at the floor and whispered, "They won't let us." 2 days later, I drove back alone to grab essentials. I didn't want her setting foot in that place again. I arrived around noon. The house was silent. Sunlight angled through the windows, and the air was still. I started packing clothes and papers, trying not to look too long at any mirror or dark hallway. I avoided the barn. Then I heard a sound, metal clanging like something knocking against the well cover out front. I froze. It came again, sharp, hollow. I stepped outside and saw the cover was off the well, lying in the grass beside it. I hadn't touched it. I walked toward it slowly, every part of me screaming not to look. But I did. At the bottom, maybe 40 feet down, stood a girl, pale, wearing a faded blue dress, her head tilted up at me. I couldn't see her face clearly. just the shine of her eyes. I stumbled backward and fell, scraping my arm. When I looked again, she was gone. I bolted into the house and locked the door. I called Claire and told her I was coming back. She didn't answer. As I turned to leave, the hallway light exploded above me. The bulb shattered and glass rained down. I backed away. Then came the footsteps. Heavy. Upstairs. I ran out the front door and didn't stop until I was back in the car. I drove back to the motel. When I opened the door, Claire was gone. I searched the town, called the police. They found nothing, no trace of her leaving the motel. Her purse and ID were still there. Her shoes were still under the bed. I waited for days. Posters. Phone calls. Nothing. I went back one last time, just to see if I'd missed something. The front door was open. Inside, everything was just as I left it, except on the wall of the guest room, something new had been written in soot or ash. It's not your house. Below that, in Claire's handwriting, were the words, "She's still in the well." I burned the house 2 days later, poured gasoline from room to room, watched it go up from the safety of the field. The fire was massive, consumed the barn, the trees around it, everything. Nobody questioned it. No one from town came. But I dream of it every night. The girl in the well, the humming, Claire's voice repeating the same sentence again and again. It was never our house.
Story number 3.
When my dad inherited the farmhouse, none of us were thrilled. It was his late uncle's place, about 4 hours from where we lived in northern Illinois, sitting at the edge of a nearly abandoned farming town called Coster. I was 21, home from college for the summer, and my mom refused to step foot on the property. She claimed she had bad memories there from the few times she visited as a teenager. Something about the house gave her a wrong feeling, she said. My dad dismissed it. He thought she was being dramatic. My brother Mark and I went with him the first weekend to look it over, clean up what we could, and take inventory of what needed repairs. The house itself was isolated, sitting on a stretch of overgrown land bordered by woods on one side and an open cornfield on the other. It had that old, forgotten look. 2 stories, chipped white paint, broken shutters hanging by rusted hinges, and a sagging porch that creaked with every step. It hadn't been lived in for nearly a decade since Dad's uncle died alone there. His body wasn't discovered for days. That should have been a warning. We didn't take it seriously. Inside, the air was thick and stale, like something had been sitting still too long. Furniture was still there, covered in yellowed sheets. Photos on the walls were dust-covered, the people in them faded with age. There was no electricity. The lines had been shut off years ago. The water came from an old pump and well system that still groaned to life after a few tries. That first night, we brought camping lanterns and flashlights, ate cold sandwiches, and stayed in sleeping bags in the front room. It was that first night when I started feeling like something was off. I'd gone to the bathroom around 2 a.m., careful not to wake Mark. As I passed the staircase in the hallway, I felt a blast of cold air, even though every window was closed. I turned around thinking maybe Dad had come downstairs, but no one was there. The hall was empty. I swear I heard faint footsteps above me, slow and deliberate. I froze, listening. It didn't make sense. The upstairs hadn't been used in years. I told myself it was the house settling. Old places creak, wood shifts, pipes groan. That's all it was. The next day, Mark and I took to clearing out the back rooms. We found old books, photographs, and an upright piano that was missing several keys. It sat silent in the far corner of the parlor room. When we tried to move it, the house seemed to shake, just slightly, but enough to make us stop and glance at each other. The walls made strange noises, like sighs under the floorboards. Later that afternoon, I wandered into what used to be the guest bedroom, and there I found a journal. It was tucked into the bottom drawer of a vanity. The leather was dry and cracking, but most of the pages were still intact. It belonged to my great-uncle, though most entries stopped in the late 90s. The last few were odd. They've returned. The girl in the hall is crying again. Last night I heard someone tapping on the windows. I locked every door, but she still found a way in. I saw her in the corner, just standing there. Another entry. I should never have ignored the attic. The smell won't go away. They scratch at the walls. The floorboards are whispering. I showed my dad and he laughed it off. Old man was senile by the end. You know that. Probably had dementia or something. That night, we heard the tapping. At first, it was faint, just a soft rhythmic sound on the windows. We were in our sleeping bags again, and I thought maybe it was a branch hitting the glass. Then it started moving. First the front window, then the side, then the back. Dad got up and looked outside, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing. The tapping stopped when he opened the door, but started again the moment he closed it. It didn't stop until sunrise. The next morning, we found footprints in the dirt outside. Bare footprints, small ones. They circled the house twice, and then disappeared toward the back edge of the woods. My dad claimed it was probably kids messing around, even though there were no children in the area, and the closest neighbor was nearly a mile away. We stayed one more night. That's when things really changed. Around 3:30 a.m., I woke up to the piano playing. Just 3 notes. Over and over again. Ding, ding, ding. Slow and measured. I sat up, thinking maybe Mark was messing around, but he was still zipped in his sleeping bag, facing the other way. I looked to the doorway, and I swear, God help me, I saw a figure standing in the dark. Small. Pale. Just standing and facing the wall. I couldn't breathe. The figure slowly turned its head. I didn't see a face, just the shape of a child, hair hanging down past its shoulders. Then it was gone, like smoke disappearing into the air. I scrambled over to wake my dad, but he was already up, wide-eyed and sweating. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "The piano," I said. He nodded. "And the voice." "What voice?" He didn't answer. He just stood and grabbed his boots. "We're leaving. Right now." We threw everything into the truck and drove the whole way back without speaking. The house faded into the rear view, and I didn't even look back. None of us said much for the rest of the summer. But the story didn't end there. In October, my dad went back to the house by himself. He said he needed to finish the paperwork and meet someone from the county to discuss the property line. He left on a Thursday and said he'd be back Saturday. He didn't come back. I called his cell dozens of times. No answer. By Sunday morning, I drove out there with Mark. The house was quiet when we arrived. The truck was parked out front. The front door was wide open. Inside, everything looked like he'd just walked out of the room. His flashlight was on the floor. His thermos was still half full, but there was no sign of him. We searched every room. The attic was locked, but we broke the latch and went in. Nothing. Just old furniture and a trunk filled with decaying dolls. The smell was awful, mold and rot and something sour. We went to the cellar last. The door was already open. There we found something neither of us expected. The piano, the one from the parlor, was down there, even though we'd never moved it. It sat in the dirt, keys broken, wood warped from moisture. My brother started to cry. Then the tapping started. From behind the walls. We ran. The police searched the area for days. They found nothing. No body. No blood. Just his boots sitting neatly beside the piano in the cellar. My mom refuses to talk about it now. She won't even say the name Custer. She told me once, when she'd had too much wine, that she remembers visiting that farmhouse as a girl, that she saw the same child in the hallway mirror, watching her, smiling. We never went back. Last year, a man bought the property at auction. He lasted 3 weeks, said the place was cursed, that something lived in the walls. He found drawings scratched into the floorboards upstairs, symbols that didn't make sense, spirals with jagged edges and crosses through them. No one owns the place now. It just sits there, rotting, waiting. I still hear the piano sometimes, usually in dreams, and every time it plays those same 3 notes, ding, ding, ding. Sometimes I wake up to the sound of tapping on my window. I live on the 3rd floor. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It started with a single email, a forwarded property listing from my cousin in Nebraska. I'd been looking to get away from the city, and the ad promised acres of quiet land, a decent-sized farmhouse, and a barn. The pictures were old, slightly washed out, but the place looked sturdy and weathered in a way that appealed to me. The price was low, suspiciously low, but the agent claimed the owner was just eager to sell and move closer to their family on the East Coast. I drove out to see it one overcast afternoon in early October. The air smelled of dry hay and chilled earth, and the trees around the property looked brittle and gray. The house was a 2-story structure with chipped white paint and a wraparound porch. It sat like a tired animal in the middle of a dry field, with the barn looming a few hundred feet behind it. A rusted windmill creaked slowly beside the barn. The agent was a quiet man named Harold. He barely said much beyond what was necessary, but I did catch him looking toward the house several times with a kind of grim distance in his eyes. "You'll want to replace the locks," he said at one point, not really looking at me. I moved in 2 weeks later with only a bed frame, mattress, a couple of boxes of clothes, some cookware, and my dog, Jasper. He was a mutt, mostly lab, and normally pretty relaxed, but the moment we pulled up to the house, he began whining. He wouldn't go inside at first, just sat at the edge of the porch with his ears back and his body tense. I carried him in after dark, after failing to coax him in with treats or his favorite toy. He sat in a corner of the living room all night, alert and staring at the stairs. The house smelled of old wood, something faintly sweet like apples, and another underlying scent, dampness or maybe mold. That first night, I slept with the bedroom window cracked open. The wind made the barn door bang intermittently, which I expected, but sometime past midnight, I thought I heard something else. A dragging sound, like heavy cloth scraping across wood, and a single dull knock from somewhere downstairs. Jasper didn't bark. He just stood at the bedroom door, stiff. The next day, I checked the house thoroughly. Everything was locked. Nothing was missing or moved. Still, I replaced the locks like Harold suggested. That night, Jasper wouldn't go up the stairs. I ended up sleeping downstairs on the couch just to keep him calm. Over the following week, the house seemed to breathe with its own rhythm. Doors would be half open when I remembered closing them. Lights flickered. I chalked it up to old wiring. Sometimes in the early hours before dawn, I'd wake up and swear I heard faint whispering beneath the wind, words too soft to be clear, but shaped like voices. The barn was worse. The second time I went out there, I noticed something odd, symbols scratched into the wood beams. They were old, faded, but clearly deliberate. Circles with jagged lines inside them like suns with broken rays. A large ring of salt lined the dirt floor in one corner, half scattered. I didn't sleep that night. Jasper paced. Just after 3 a.m., I heard heavy footsteps upstairs. The house was old. It creaked under weight, but these weren't the harmless noises of a settling foundation. They were slow and deliberate, like boots crossing the hallway. Then, silence. I stayed on the couch with a kitchen knife. Morning came, and nothing had been disturbed. I drove into town the next day and found the local library. The town wasn't big, barely a few hundred people, but the librarian, an older woman named Edith, was helpful. I asked her if she knew anything about the farmhouse. She blinked at me when I described it. "That old Miller place?" she said, her expression flattening. "I thought they'd finally demolished it. Been empty for years." I told her I'd bought it recently. She stared at me a long moment, then lowered her voice. "You didn't see anything strange out by the barn, did you?" I hesitated. "There's markings out there," I said. "Symbols." Her eyes flicked down to the desk, then to the window behind me. "Back in the 60s, she whispered, "there was a family that moved in. Husband, wife, 2 kids. They weren't there a year before the wife was found drowned in the creek behind the property. Husband hanged himself in the barn. One of the kids was never found." I felt sick. They said the place was cursed. There were stories, long before the Millers. People disappearing, animals dying in strange ways. The barn, it's wrong. It's always been wrong. That night, I sealed the barn door with a chain and padlock. I spread fresh salt across the threshold, feeling foolish, but the air inside that barn had shifted. It felt thicker, like walking into a place that had forgotten time. I could swear I saw movement in the upper rafters as I backed out. I didn't sleep well. Around 2 a.m., Jasper growled low, staring toward the back door. A single knock echoed from the porch. Slow. Measured. Not like a visitor. 3 knocks, then silence. I sat frozen on the edge of the couch, holding my breath. Jasper's hackles were raised. He didn't bark. He didn't move. The knocks didn't come again. I checked in the morning. There were no footprints, but there was something else, small handprints on the back window. Tiny, like a child's, smudged against the glass from the inside. I called Harold, left 3 voicemails. He never called back. I started leaving lights on in every room. Every night felt heavier, like the house was sinking into the ground. Jasper grew more withdrawn. He wouldn't eat unless I sat next to him. He refused to go near the stairway. More than once, I saw him staring at something that wasn't there, tracking invisible movement across the room with his eyes. One night, just after Halloween, I woke up to the sound of a child crying. It was faint, but unmistakable. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way down the stairs. The crying stopped as I reached the bottom, then silence, until the whispering began. It wasn't just one voice now, it was layered, many voices murmuring just below the edge of comprehension, drifting from the walls. My skin went cold. I turned in a circle, the beam of light from my flashlight trembling. Then I saw it, a figure at the top of the stairs. Not quite a child, not quite an adult. Pale, hair wet, eyes black and glistening. Its limbs were too long, too thin. It tilted its head slowly, and then it smiled. Not like a person, like a predator. I ran out the front door barefoot, Jasper at my side. We slept in the truck until morning. The next day I boarded up the second floor. I didn't care if it was irrational. Something up there didn't want me in that house, and I didn't want to know what it would do if I stayed another night. I packed my things, but before I left, I went back to the barn one last time. I needed to understand what had happened. Maybe closure. Maybe stupidity. I brought bolt cutters and a crowbar. The barn was quiet as I stepped inside. Dust hung thick in the light. The salt ring had been completely scattered. Something had drawn new symbols into the dirt. Fresh ones. I knelt to inspect them, heart pounding. Then I heard it again. Crying. From above. The loft. I looked up and saw something hanging from the rafters. At first, I thought it was a bag or old rope. But as I climbed the ladder, the shape took on form. It was a doll. Hand-stitched, old, stuffed with straw. Around its neck was a loop of frayed rope. Its eyes were made of small black buttons. One was missing. The air grew colder as I stepped onto the loft floor. Then I noticed the small handprints on the wood, and the footprints, bare, small, leading to the back wall. There, carved into the wood, were names. Dozens of them. Some etched deeply, violently, some nearly worn away. At the bottom was mine, freshly carved. I didn't hear anything at first. Just whined. Then the floor groaned behind me. I turned, and the last thing I saw before I blacked out was that same pale figure crawling down from the rafters, moving in sharp, unnatural angles like a spider trying to walk like a man. I woke in the dirt just outside the barn. Jasper was licking my face, whining. The sun was rising. I didn't go back inside. I didn't even go back for my boxes. I drove straight to the next town over and called a friend in Kansas City. I left the farmhouse, the barn, the cursed ground behind me. 2 weeks later, I read in the paper that the farmhouse burned down. No explanation, no one living there, just flames in the night. The fire department never found the cause. But I did get one final reminder. A week after the fire, I received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was the doll. Still missing one eye. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
It was my uncle Vikram who decided to move back to our ancestral farmhouse after his retirement. He had been a professor in Mumbai for over 30 years, and his wife, my Aunt Malti, passed away the previous year. With no children of his own, and little to keep him in the city, he chose to return to the farmhouse in the remote countryside of Madhya Pradesh, about 40 kilometers from the nearest town. The farmhouse was old, built by our great-grandfather in the 1920s, and surrounded by overgrown fields and thick groves of tamarind and neem trees. For as long as I could remember, it had been a place of eerie tales and whispered warnings, especially among the elders, but I had always brushed them off as old village superstitions. When he first moved in, Uncle Vikram called me every evening to update me on the repairs. The place was a wreck, he said. Leaking ceilings, broken windows, rat infestations, and worse, the silence. "It's too quiet here, Arjun," he said during one call. "I can hear my own heartbeat at night." I visited him once that September. The monsoons had just passed, leaving the fields soggy and the air thick with the scent of damp soil. The house was isolated, standing stoically among the swaying crops. It was a 2-story structure, its once white walls now stained by rain and time. Ivy crept up its sides like veins, and the wooden shutters creaked even when there was no wind. I stayed for 3 days. Nothing strange happened, but something about the house unsettled me. Maybe it was the locked room on the second floor. My uncle claimed the key had been lost decades ago. Maybe it was the well behind the house which had been sealed shut with concrete. Or maybe it was the way the crows never perched on the farmhouse roof, no matter how many gathered in the surrounding trees. Uncle seemed thinner than I remembered. His eyes sunken, his voice often trailing off mid-sentence. He told me he had trouble sleeping, always waking up at 3 a.m. sharp, like something was pulling him from his dreams. Sometimes, he whispered on my last night there, I think I hear footsteps upstairs, but when I go up, there's nothing, just the locked room and silence. I left feeling uneasy. Over the next few weeks, my uncle's calls became less frequent. When he did call, he spoke slowly, distracted like his mind was elsewhere. One night, he called me in a panic. Arjun, she's here, the woman in white. I saw her standing by the well. I thought he was hallucinating. Maybe the isolation was getting to him. I asked him to come back to the city to let me stay at the farmhouse for a while, but he refused. I can't leave her, he said. She watches me. If I go, she'll follow. 2 days later, the village postman found the front door of the farmhouse wide open. The house was in disarray, books scattered, furniture overturned. Uncle Vikram was gone. I took a week off and traveled to the farmhouse myself. The local police had filed a missing person report, but they didn't seem particularly motivated to search the area. Old man probably wandered off into the woods, the officer said with a shrug. I knew better. Something was wrong. When I arrived at the farmhouse, the sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the fields. The house felt colder than I remembered, even though it was a humid October evening. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air smelled of mildew and something else, something coppery, like old blood. Dust coated every surface. I found my uncle's cell phone on the dining table, still charged, with his last call made to me. The voice messages were garbled, mostly static, except one. She came into the house last night. I locked the door, but she was already inside. I don't think she ever left the locked room. I was wrong to open it. But he told me there was no key. I checked the second floor. The locked room was still shut tight. I tried every key I could find in the house, but none fit. That night, I stayed in the guest room on the ground floor. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional scuttling of rats in the ceiling. At exactly 3 a.m., I woke up gasping, not because of a sound or a dream, but because of a smell. Jasmine, sweet and overwhelming. My aunt used to wear jasmine perfume, and then I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, on the wooden floor above me. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack and crept to the staircase. The steps groaned under my weight. As I reached the landing, the footsteps stopped. I stood outside the locked door. The smell of jasmine was stronger here, almost suffocating. The door was still locked, but I could hear something behind it, a faint scraping, like nails on wood. I stumbled back to my room and locked the door. I didn't sleep. The next day, I searched the house again. In the attic, behind some old trunks, I found an iron key. It was large, rusted, and ornate. I knew it belonged to that room. I waited until noon, when the sunlight was at its strongest, before trying the key. My heart pounded as I slid it into the lock. It clicked easily. The door swung open with a shriek. The room was pitch black, the windows nailed shut with rotting planks. Dust motes floated in the slivers of light that pierced through the cracks. The smell was unbearable. Jasmine, rot, and decay. The walls were scratched, gouged with deep lines, as if someone had clawed at them for years. In the corner I saw something. A cot. Chains. A woman's sandal. And on the floor, a yellowing photograph. It was a picture of a young woman, maybe in her early 20s. Her eyes had been scratched out with something sharp. On the back was written, Kamla, 1963. I ran out and vomited in the hallway. That night, I locked the door again and planned to leave in the morning. But I never made it to dawn. I woke up at 3 a.m. again, this time not from the smell, but the sound of whispering. It was right outside my door. I couldn't move. Every muscle locked in place as the whispering grew louder, more urgent. It was a woman's voice repeating something in Hindi over and over. Kala, mujhe bahar nikal. Open, open, let me out. The doorknob jiggled, and then silence. When I could finally move, I forced myself to open the door. The hallway was empty, but there were wet footprints, bare, small, leading away from my room toward the stairs. I followed them. They stopped at the locked room. I grabbed the key again, drawn by something I couldn't explain. Maybe I needed answers. Maybe I just wanted to end it. The room was colder than before. In the faint light, I saw something new on the cot, an outline, like someone had just been lying there. And then I saw her. She stood in the corner, facing the wall. Her long black hair covered her face, and her white sari was stained and torn. Her arms hung unnaturally long, her fingers nearly touching the floor. She turned around. Her face was wrong, sunken, eyeless, with a mouth that seemed too wide for her face. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I screamed and ran, slamming the door shut and throwing the key into the fields outside. I left that night, driving through the darkness until I reached the main road. I never went back. They found my uncle's body weeks later, deep in the forest, kneeling beside a tree. His eyes were missing, and his mouth was torn into a grotesque smile. The coroner ruled it as animal attack, but I knew better. The farmhouse has since been abandoned. The villagers say they still hear whispers near the tamarind trees at night. Some say they see a woman in white walking along the fields, always at 3 a.m. No one goes near the place anymore, and neither will I. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was late September when I moved into the farmhouse. A job transfer forced me out of the city and into the rural flatlands of western Nebraska. I'd never been a country person, and the silence hit me harder than I expected. The property was cheap, absurdly so. The realtor called it a fixer-upper with charm, and I was desperate enough to accept the offer without thinking twice. The house stood alone on a half-acre of wind-blown prairie, old and gray with chipped paint curling off its wooden siding like dead skin. A 2-story structure with a sagging roof, 4 rooms, and an attic. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. There was a barn, too, collapsed halfway into the tall grass, its roof sunken in like the chest of a dying animal. The first few nights were uneventful, if a little unnerving. The floorboards creaked constantly, and the wind howled like a living thing. I assumed all the noises were the house settling or wildlife moving through the fields. On the 3rd night, I heard something new, something I couldn't rationalize as the wind. It was a thudding noise, slow and heavy, like someone walking across the attic above my room. I was in bed under the covers, and the sound started just after midnight. I stared at the ceiling, holding my breath. The steps moved from one end of the attic to the other. I waited for them to stop, but they didn't. They went on for what felt like hours. Eventually, I fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, I grabbed a flashlight and pulled the attic hatch down. The stairs groaned under my weight. I expected dust, cobwebs, maybe some old furniture, but the attic was almost empty. Almost. In the far corner, sitting neatly in a square of sunlight from the one tiny window, was a wooden rocking chair. It looked hand-carved, decked with a high back and curved runners worn smooth from use. I didn't remember seeing it during my initial walkthrough with the realtor. Dust covered everything in the attic except for the chair. It looked as if someone had just placed it there. That night, I tried to ignore the footsteps. I wore earbuds and played white noise to drown it out. Still, I woke up at 3:13 a.m. to the same sound, deliberate, slow footsteps above me. I lay still, terrified, until dawn crept in through the curtains. The following day, I called the realtor to ask about the property's history. She seemed surprised by my question and hesitated before speaking. "There's a reason it was so cheap," she finally admitted. Back in the 70s, a woman named Ruth Langan lived there with her son. He was mentally unstable, violent, according to neighbors. One night, she disappeared. Just vanished. Her son claimed she went to visit family in Iowa, but she never arrived. Police couldn't prove anything, and the son ended up in a mental institution. Nobody's lived in that house for more than a year or two since. I didn't ask more questions. I didn't want to know. The footsteps grew more erratic. Some nights they started around midnight, others just after 2 a.m. They always lasted at least an hour. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom beneath the attic and moved to the downstairs living room. That didn't help. Now, the noises weren't just upstairs. I began to hear whispering in the hallways, unintelligible murmurs like a radio station just out of range. I checked every room, every vent, every window. There was nothing. On the 7th night, I woke up to the sound of the front door slowly creaking open. I was sure I had locked it. I always did. I grabbed the fireplace poker and crept toward the door. It stood wide open, cold air spilling into the room. Outside, there was only darkness and wind. I slammed it shut and bolted it. The next morning, I found a muddy footprint on the kitchen floor. Just one. Human. Bare. The toes were long, almost inhumanly so. I took a picture and sent it to a friend in Lincoln, asking what he thought. He replied, "Dude, that's not normal. You should leave." But I didn't. I had no place else to go. That evening, I burned sage throughout the house, something I'd read about online. I even lit candles and repeated phrases I didn't understand, just trying to get the air to feel lighter. I think it only made things worse. That night, the rocking chair in the attic began to move. It started with a low creak, then another, and another. I stood at the bottom of the attic stairs and stared up into the dark, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The chair rocked steadily, as if someone were sitting in it, rhythmically shifting their weight. Then the footsteps started again, crossing the attic above me. But this time they didn't stay there. They came down. I heard the attic stairs groan, step by step, under an invisible weight. I backed away slowly, heart hammering, poker clutched so tight my fingers ached. The steps reached the bottom, but I saw nothing. Then, without warning, the lights flickered and went out. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to scan the hallway. There was no one. But the air was ice cold, colder than it should have been, and I could feel something watching me. I left the house that night and drove to a motel 30 miles away. I didn't care about the money I'd sunk into the place. I just wanted to feel safe. The next day, I went back to pack a few essentials. The house was still and silent when I arrived, but something was different. The rocking chair was gone. I searched the attic, top to bottom. Nothing. It wasn't downstairs either. I checked outside in the barn, even in the cellar beneath the kitchen. Nothing. I was just about to leave when I noticed the crawl space panel in the back of the coat closets was ajar. It had been nailed shut when I moved in. My stomach dropped. I crouched down and pulled it open. A foul, rotting smell hit me instantly. I turned on my phone light and pointed it inside. There, beneath the floorboards, was the rocking chair, positioned carefully in the center of the crawl space, like it was meant to be there. A bundle of old rags sat in the chair, and as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't rags. It was a bundle of clothes, women's clothes rotted with age and stained dark, and beside the chair, partially buried in the dirt, were bones. I couldn't breathe. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. I grabbed my phone, took a picture, and ran. I sent the photo to the police. They took it seriously, and within hours I was with dogs and ground-penetrating radar. They dug for 3 days and uncovered a full human skeleton wrapped in a decayed floral dress. Dental records confirmed it was Ruth Langan. The case reopened. The son was still alive, institutionalized, and they brought him in for questioning. He confessed within hours, said she wouldn't leave him alone, that even in death she still talked to him from under the floor. Said the house was never empty, not really. He buried her in the crawl space after killing her in a fit of rage. They tore the house down the following month. Sometimes late at night, I think I can still hear the rocking. Even though I live 3 states away now, even though there's nothing but a field where that farmhouse once stood. I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, and wonder if she followed me. I'll never live in the countryside again. Story the end.
Story number 7.
My parents were never the type to indulge in ghost stories. They were practical people, farmers by profession, born and raised in central Bihar, in a region known for its rice paddies and mango orchards. My father, Amarjeet, had inherited our family farmhouse from his grandfather, a sprawling, worn-down property that stood alone on a patch of land bordered by a shallow creek and thickets of wild bamboo. When I was a child, I would spend my summer vacations there, running barefoot through the fields and falling asleep to the rhythmic croaking of frogs. Nothing ever felt wrong about the place. At least, not then. The farmhouse itself was old, made of brick and timber with a rusted tin roof patched in places with tarps. Inside, it smelled of turmeric and old books, and the creaky wooden floorboards sang a different tune with every step. There were 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a veranda facing the fields, but it was the small storeroom in the back with its iron padlock and cracked doorframe that always caught my attention as a boy. My father told me never to open it, saying it was filled with nothing but junk from generations past. I never questioned it, at least not until he passed away. It was in April 2021 that he suffered a sudden heart attack. My mother had already passed 3 years before, and being the only child, I inherited everything. Mostly debt, but also that farmhouse. I was living in Delhi at the time, working as a freelance photographer. When I returned for the funeral, I planned only to stay for a week. But something compelled me to stay longer. There was a sense of unfinished business hanging in the air. The farmhouse hadn't been lived in for months, and the fields had turned wild. Dust blanketed every surface, and mice had made homes inside the old pantry. I began cleaning, partly out of respect and partly out of restlessness. It felt like a way to mourn. I would wake at dawn, sweep the floors, chase out spiders, and occasionally talk to myself just to fill the silence. I didn't plan on opening the storeroom, but by the fifth night I had started hearing noises from that side of the house. Faint tapping at first, like fingers on wood, then creaking. On the seventh night, I swore I heard someone walking around inside. It wasn't mice. These were deliberate steps, slow and heavy. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks, grief manifesting in strange ways. But the sound grew more intense, waking me around 3:15 a.m. every morning. It always started the same way, a low groaning from the floorboards near the storeroom, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I would sit upright in bed, heart racing, straining to hear more, but the noise would stop as soon as I moved. On the ninth day, I decided to open the storeroom. The key was in a drawer in the kitchen, tied with a red string and wrapped in a thin cloth. As soon as I picked it up, I felt a chill, even though it was 35 degrees outside. I waited until noon to unlock the door, when the sun was high and I felt braver. The door groaned as it opened. The air inside was foul, musty, thick, with decay. Dust swirled in the sunlight as I stepped inside. The room was smaller than I expected. Just a few shelves, an old trunk, and what looked like ritual items, burnt incense sticks, dried flowers, and broken clay pots. One wall had markings scratched into it. Symbols I didn't recognize, but they looked frantic, carved deep into the plaster. Inside the trunk, I found a bundle of yellowed newspapers, a lock of matted black hair, and a cloth doll with its face rubbed off. Tucked beneath the doll was an envelope. I hesitated before opening it. My hands were shaking. Inside was a letter written in my grandfather's handwriting. The ink had faded, but I could still make out most of the words. To whoever finds this, I am sorry. I should not have brought her here. She was not human. She begged me for shelter during the floods. She was soaked, crying, barefoot, and carrying nothing. I thought I was saving a life, but I was wrong. She brought darkness. The crops died. The animals refused to go near her. My brother hanged himself after she touched his head. My wife bled for weeks and never recovered. And when I tried to send her away, she smiled. She said she had buried herself in this house. I trapped her in this room. Do not open it. If you do, never sleep here again. My stomach turned. I put the letter down and backed out of the room, locking it again and placing the key back in the drawer. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound made my skin crawl. At exactly 3:15 a.m., the sounds returned. But this time, they didn't stop when I sat up. I heard slow footsteps coming from the storeroom, then the sound of the locked door creaking. I knew I had locked it. I checked the key myself. Still, I heard the hinges crying under weight. And then I heard breathing. It was not mine. It was deep, ragged, coming from just outside my bedroom door. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. I pulled the blanket over my head like a child and lay perfectly still, every muscle tense. The breathing stayed for what felt like hours, then faded. At dawn, I checked the storeroom. The door was still shut, the lock intact. But there were muddy footprints on the floor outside, bare, narrow, pointed slightly inward like a woman's. I left that day and returned to Delhi. For months, I avoided the house. I didn't tell anyone. I tried to convince myself it was a hallucination, some side effect of grief and stress. But my cousin Rahul, who managed some of the surrounding farmland, called me one night in November. He said one of the field workers quit after seeing a woman standing in the orchard at night, motionless, staring at the house. She wore white, he said. Long black hair. No feet. I froze. My cousin had no idea about the letter. I hadn't told a soul. A few weeks later, Rahul came to Delhi. He looked shaken, pale, said he wasn't going back there. The air isn't right, he told me. It feels like something's watching. Every time I turned around, I thought I'd see her. The farmhouse fell into disrepair. No one wanted to work the land. Even the villagers from the nearby settlement said the place was cursed. They spoke of a chudale, a vengeful spirit of a woman who died with unfinished business. Many believed they were bound to certain places. Some said they fed off sorrow. In February 2022, I received a call from a stranger claiming to be a historian from Patna University. He had somehow read about the letter in a local archive, where old estate documents from my family's lineage had been stored. He wanted to see the house, to document it for a book about local folklore. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him there. We arrived mid-afternoon. The house looked dead, cracks like veins running down the walls, doors barely hanging on hinges. Inside, the smell was worse than before. The historian, a thin man in his 40s named Aditya, walked carefully, noting the symbols, the items in the storeroom, and the letter. He didn't say much until dusk. "This isn't just a haunting," he finally said. "This is a binding. Whoever your grandfather trapped here wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. She was something else. Maybe once human, maybe not." I asked him what we should do. He paused. "You could burn the house down, it might sever the bond. But if the binding was done improperly, it could release her instead." We left before dark. 2 weeks later, Aditya went back alone. He never returned. His car was found parked outside the gate, keys still in the ignition. The driver's seat was soaked in blood, but no body, just strands of long black hair on the seat. The police called it a wild animal attack. But there were no signs of struggle outside, no paw prints, just a single set of footprints, bare and thin, leading toward the creek and stopping at the water. I sold the land a year later to a development group. They wanted to build a resort there. I never told them what I knew. They demolished the house, or tried to. The demolition team refused to touch the storeroom. Every time they tried, something went wrong. Equipment failures, injuries, even a crane collapse that killed a worker. In the end, they built around it. They turned the storeroom into a storage shed, painted it to match the resort aesthetic, but the door remained bolted from the outside. Guests have reported strange sightings, a woman walking the fields at night, lights flickering in empty halls, and a voice whispering near the creek. The resort's reviews online always mention the same thing. People wake up at exactly 3:15 a.m., cold, sweating, with the distinct feeling of being watched. I haven't gone back, and I never will. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I grew up in a small town just outside of Billings, Montana, surrounded by farmland and long stretches of highway that seemed to lead nowhere. Most people there kept to themselves, working land that had been in their families for generations. As a teenager, I used to work odd jobs for the older farmers in the area, hauling hay, repairing fences, clearing brush. That's how I ended up at the Holloway farm during the summer of 2002. Everyone in town knew the place, but not many talked about it. It sat alone at the edge of a pine grove about 6 miles off the main road, and even from a distance, it looked wrong. The fields around it were overgrown, patches of dead grass cutting through like scars. The farmhouse itself was an old Victorian-style structure with a sagging roof and crooked shutters. People said it hadn't been lived in since the 1970s, but one day the sheriff's brother, Earl Holloway, came into town asking if anyone knew a strong kid willing to help him restore it. I needed the money and didn't believe in ghost stories, so I said yes. Earl was in his 50s, a wiry man with a nervous smile and calloused hands. He wasn't unfriendly, but something about him seemed tired in a way that wasn't just physical. He picked me up in his truck and drove us out to the property without saying much. When we arrived, the air felt noticeably cooler, like walking into a room where someone had just opened a freezer. I remember stepping out and hearing the wind pass through the pines, and yet the grass around the farmhouse didn't move. Our first few days were mostly cleanup, ripping out rotten floorboards, hauling off broken furniture, and scrubbing down the walls. Earl never let me stay after sundown. He always said, "We wrap it up before the light dies. Bad footing in the dark." I didn't argue, but something about how he locked the front door with a heavy chain when we left each evening struck me as odd. It was on the 4th day that I found the cellar door under the kitchen rug. The wood around it was soft with rot, and the handle was rusted, but with enough force, I got it open. A set of stone steps led down into blackness. The air that rose from it was cold and smelled of mildew and something else, something metallic like old blood. I called for Earl, But when he came in and saw the open door, he froze. "I told my brother to seal that damn thing," he muttered, and without another word, he went down to the basement with a flashlight. I waited at the top, listening. It was silent for a long time. Then I heard him shout, "Close it!" with such force that I jumped. He came back up with dirt on his shirt and his flashlight flickering, his face pale as bone. He slammed the door shut and nailed it down on the spot, then rolled the rug back over it. From that day on, things changed. The house felt heavier, like something unseen had been disturbed. Tools started going missing. Nothing major, just hammers or measuring tape, but we'd find them later in strange places, like the bathtub upstairs or inside the hollow of a wall. One morning, I came in and found all the chairs stacked on the kitchen table, balanced in a way that defied gravity. Earl said nothing, just knocked them down and told me to focus on the drywall. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing something scratching at my bedroom window. I lived on the second floor of a duplex, and there was no tree nearby. The scratching went on for hours until it suddenly stopped at 3:17 a.m. I remember that time because my alarm clock blinked, the power having gone out for just a moment, and when it came back on, the time read 3:17. When I told Earl the next morning, he just stared at me for a long time and said, "You sure you want to keep doing this job?" I said yes, stubborn and broke. One afternoon, I was replacing tiles in the upstairs bathroom when I noticed the mirror on the medicine cabinet was fogged over like someone had just taken a hot shower. The windows were open, and there was no plumbing yet. No way for there to be steam. I leaned closer and saw a word slowly etching itself into the glass, as if traced by a finger from the other side. Run. I blinked and stepped back. Earl was downstairs, so I called out, and he came up with his usual flashlight. I told him what I saw, but by then the mirror was clean again. He didn't say anything, just wiped his forehead and said we'd take the rest of the day off. That was the first time he asked me if I had any family I could stay with for a while. I thought he was being dramatic. Over the next week, it got worse. We heard footsteps at night when we were locking up, loud ones, like someone sprinting across the attic, but there was no one up there. One time, we came in and found the words, "Go back," carved into the wood of the front door. We hadn't brought any carving tools, and the depth of the gouges made it clear this wasn't done with a pocket knife. Booms echoed from the cellar some mornings, like heavy furniture being dropped. I once found my lunchbox sitting in the middle of the barn, 200 feet from where I'd left it in the kitchen. Inside, all my food was rotted and filled with maggots, even though it had been fresh just hours before. The last day I spent at the Holloway place started like any other. I was upstairs, finishing patchwork near the hallway when I heard Earl call my name. I stepped out and saw him standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking pale. "I need your help in the basement," he said. His voice was flat, emotionless. I paused. "You mean the one you nailed shut?" He didn't respond, just turned and started walking toward the kitchen. I hesitated, something feeling off, then followed him. When I got to the kitchen, the rug had been pulled back and the cellar door was open. Earl stood by it, staring down into the darkness. His flashlight was on the floor, broken. "I need you to come down," he said, without looking at me. I stepped closer. Something about his posture wasn't right, too still, too stiff. I glanced behind me, suddenly uneasy, and when I looked back at Earl, he was gone. Gone. Just vanished, like a bad cut in a film reel. The cellar door was still open. I should have run, but I crept forward and peeked inside. It was pitch black. I called out his name, and the echo that came back wasn't my own voice. It was deeper, slower, like someone mocking me. I slammed the door shut, I bolted it, and ran outside to the truck. I waited until sundown, thinking Earl might come back, but he never did. I called the sheriff, his brother, and when they searched the property, they found nothing in the cellar. Just old cobwebs, broken stone shelves, and what looked like symbols carved into the walls, some dating back almost a century. They never found Earl. I quit the job, I left town a week later, and never went back. A year after, I read a brief article in a local paper saying the Horrifying Farmhouse had burned down. Electrical fire, they said, even though the place didn't have power. The article didn't mention Earl. For years, I tried to forget about it, told myself maybe Earl had some kind of breakdown. Maybe I hallucinated the worst of it. Maybe the house was just old and dangerous, and that explained everything. But sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up to the sound of scratching at my window. And no matter where I live, it always happens at exactly 3:17 a.m. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The farmhouse was a last-minute purchase, a desperate grab for stability after the divorce. I had inherited a small settlement fund from my grandmother, and with it, I bought the old place on the outskirts of a rural town in Kentucky. It was an old structure, 2 stories, with peeling white paint, green shutters, and a wide porch that sagged in the middle. The realtor assured me it had character, though she avoided mentioning any quirks or local lore. I was too eager to move on to ask many questions. The first time I visited, it was a bright, sunny day in early October. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke from distant chimneys. The house sat alone, surrounded by overgrown fields and wild woods. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on your ears and makes every small sound feel amplified. I found the interior cluttered with the remnants of previous owners, old furniture covered in sheets, dusty framed photographs leaning against the walls, and piles of newspapers yellowed with age. I spent that first afternoon cleaning, unpacking, and trying to make the place feel like home. There was something about the house that felt off, but I chalked it up to being unfamiliar with country living. On my first night, I woke several times to creaking floorboards and the occasional thud overhead. The house was settling, I told myself. It was an old house. The bed was in the master bedroom on the 2nd floor, directly beneath the attic. The attic hatch was in the ceiling near the corner, and I could sometimes hear faint noises above it, the soft scuffing of footsteps, the brushing of something being dragged. Sleep was fitful, the shadows in the room longer and darker than I was used to. I kept a small lamp on, even after it grew late. The second day, I explored the property more thoroughly. Behind the house was a dilapidated barn, its roof partially collapsed and the wood gray and rotten. Among the weeds near the barn, I found fragments of old glass bottles and rusted tools. I also noticed the foundation of what must have been an outhouse, now reduced to a sunken hole in the ground. As I wandered back towards the house, I caught sight of an old well near the edge of the woods, its stone rim cracked and overgrown with moss. It looked dangerous, and I made a mental note to rope it off or fill it in eventually. That night, the noises intensified. The footsteps overhead were louder, more insistent. I lay awake, heart pounding, listening to what sounded like someone pacing in the attic. Then came something new, a slow, rhythmic tapping on the ceiling directly above my head. It went on for minutes, then stopped abruptly. I decided to investigate the attic the next day. Climbing the narrow wooden stairs, I found the attic was a cramped space filled with old trunks, moth-eaten blankets, and discarded furniture. The air was stale and thick with dust. In the far corner, covered with a heavy tarp, was what looked like a large, carved wooden chest. I pulled the tarp away carefully and opened the chest. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, were several old letters tied with a ribbon, a cracked pocket watch, and a small leather-bound journal. I took the journal down and flipped through the brittle pages. The journal belonged to a woman named Margaret, who had lived in the house during the 1920s. Her handwriting was neat and precise. She wrote about daily life on the farm, the harsh winters, and the birth of her son, Thomas. The entries became darker over time. Margaret described strange noises at night, shadows moving just beyond sight, and an overwhelming sense of dread that grew heavier with each passing day. One entry caught my attention. October 15th, 1927. I hear footsteps in the attic, but Thomas is asleep in his room. The tapping at night continues. I fear something watches us. I do not know what it wants. I felt a chill. The same tapping I'd heard the night before. That evening, I sat by the fireplace, the journal open in my lap. The house felt colder than before, despite the fire. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, I counted them pacing the attic. 10 steps forward, 10 steps back, repeated over and over. Suddenly, I heard a soft, barely audible whispering. It was too faint to make out words, but it seemed to come from the hallway outside my bedroom door. I sat up straight, straining to listen. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. I called out, but my voice caught in my throat. The lights flickered and then went out completely. I scrambled for my phone, but it was dead. In the darkness, the whispering stopped. The footsteps resumed, closer now, descending the attic stairs. Frozen with fear, I held my breath as the footsteps came down the hall outside my room. The doorknob rattled lightly, as if someone, or something, was trying to open it. Then, silence. Morning came slowly. When I checked the attic again, the chest was gone. Days passed, and the house seemed to grow heavier with an unseen presence. Objects moved on their own. Cups left on the kitchen table were found overturned, doors creaked open and shut without wind, and I often felt watched. My dreams became vivid and disturbing. Shadowy figures with hollow eyes standing in the fields, whispering my name, beckoning me outside. One afternoon, I met an elderly neighbor named Ruth. She had lived in the area all her life and knew the farmhouse's history. "You've bought a place with a dark past," she told me, her eyes steady. "The family that lived there, the Langfords, they vanished without a trace. Folks say the house holds their sorrow, maybe worse." I pressed her for details. She told me about the disappearance of Margaret and her son Thomas in the late 1920s. Neighbors heard screams one night, but by morning the house was empty. No bodies were found. Some believed they'd left town, others whispered of darker things, curses, hauntings. That night, the house felt alive. The tapping turned into frantic banging. The whispering voices were louder, overlapping and overlapping in a cacophony of desperate cries. I tried to flee, but the front door slammed shut and wouldn't budge. I was trapped. In the panic, I noticed a glint beneath the floorboards near the fireplace. I pried up a loose board and found an old, rusted key wrapped in a blood-stained cloth. The key fit a small door at the base of the attic stairs, a door I'd never seen before. Behind it was a narrow crawl space filled with dirt and bones. Human bones. My hands trembled as I uncovered a small wooden box beside the remains. Inside were photographs of Margaret and Thomas and a note in Margaret's handwriting. "If you find this, know we are trapped here, bound by sorrow and violence. Free us." Determined, I contacted a local historian and a spiritual medium. They performed a cleansing ritual, praying for peace and release. For a week, the noises subsided. The house seemed lighter, warmer, but the relief was temporary. One morning, I awoke to find the rocking chair from the attic, now in my bedroom, slowly moving back and forth as if someone were sitting in it. The whispers returned, this time clearer. "Help us! Free us!" I realized then that the farmhouse was not just haunted. It was a prison for restless souls, trapped in time and pain. I left the house the next day, unable to stay another night. The realtor finally sold it again, and I never returned. Sometimes when the wind is just right, I hear the faint tapping and whispering in my dreams, and I wonder if Margaret and Thomas will ever find peace. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The Holloway Farm was the kind of place that people in our town rarely talked about, but everyone knew about it. It sat near the edge of a vast expanse of fields in rural Missouri, surrounded by old oaks and a few stubborn maples that tried to cling to life. The farmhouse itself was the kind that looked like it belonged in a history book. Peeling white paint, a sagging porch, and windows that always seemed dark no matter the time of day. My grandfather used to say the place had a bad feeling about it, something not right, but as a kid, I never paid much mind to those stories. Ghosts weren't real, and farms were farms. Years later, when I was in my early 20s, my uncle inherited that farmhouse after my grandfather passed away. The plan was to renovate it and keep it in the family. I was going through a rough patch, the kind of thing that makes you want to run away from your own life. So when my uncle asked if I could come help him out with the work, I jumped at the chance. At least there, I thought I'd be busy and away from the chaos of the city. The first time I stepped foot on the Holloway farm, a wave of cold air hit me. It was the middle of summer, yet the breeze felt unnaturally sharp and wet, as if the house breathed cold even when the sun was high. The porch creaked under my boots as I walked inside. Dust coated the wooden floors, thick enough to write your name in. The smell of old wood, damp earth, and something faintly metallic filled the air. The house was silent, except for the quiet buzzing of flies and the occasional creak that seemed to come from deep within the walls. My Uncle Tom was already there, standing in the kitchen with his sleeves rolled up, staring at the peeling wallpaper. He smiled when he saw me, but there was a tiredness in his eyes I hadn't expected. "We'll start with the kitchen," he said. If we can get it livable, then the rest won't seem so bad. For the first few days, we worked hard, scraping wallpaper, fixing loose floorboards, and hauling broken furniture out to the barn. But every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the house changed. It felt heavier. The air grew thick and hard to breathe. Sometimes I could swear I heard footsteps above me, slow and heavy, pacing the attic, even though Tom told me it was just the wind settling the old timber. One night, after we'd called it quits for the day, I was alone upstairs in one of the old bedrooms. I'd gone to check a window that wouldn't close properly. As I knelt down, I saw a figure standing at the far end of the room. Tall, blurred around the edges like a photograph left out in the sun too long. I froze. The figure didn't move, but I felt its gaze, something so cold and hollow that my skin prickled. I blinked, and it was gone. When I told Tom, he didn't seem surprised. "They don't like being disturbed," he said quietly. "This place, it's been waiting for us." Over the next week, the strange occurrences escalated. Doors slammed shut by themselves, sometimes when the wind was barely a whisper outside. Lights flickered with no explanation. I found my tools moved from where I left them, and once I discovered muddy footprints on the dusty floorboards, even though we hadn't brought boots inside for days. One afternoon, Tom found a journal wedged behind a loose panel in the hallway. The cover was worn leather, cracked from age. Inside, the pages were filled with neat handwriting from a man named Samuel Holloway, dated back to the late 1800s. The entries started innocently enough, details about planting seasons, livestock, weather, but soon turned darker. Samuel wrote about hearing voices in the night, about shadows that moved on their own, about a sickness that took his wife and child. He spoke of a presence in the house that whispered threats and of how the farm itself seemed cursed, marked by tragedy. The last entry was just one line, scrawled in desperate handwriting. "They come for me in the cellar." The cellar. I had never been down there. Tom warned me not to go. The stairs were unstable, and there was something about the place that made his skin crawl. But curiosity gnawed at me, and one evening, after Tom had gone to bed, I found the cellar door in the kitchen floor, hidden under a heavy rug. The air coming from below was frigid, like the breath of a grave. I hesitated but pulled open the door. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight as I descended into darkness. My flashlight beam flickered and danced on the stone walls, which were covered in strange symbols carved deep into the surface. At the bottom, I saw an old iron ring set into the wall, rusty and stained. Suddenly, a cold hand gripped my ankle, and I stumbled, nearly dropping my flashlight. I looked down, but there was nothing there, just the dark stone floor. I scrambled back up, heart pounding, slamming the door shut behind me. I told Tom the next day, but he only shook his head. "It's best to leave it alone," he said. "Some doors should never be opened." Sleep became impossible. I began hearing whispers under my bedroom window, soft voices calling my name, beckoning me to come outside. The scratching started next, first on the walls, then on the ceiling, like claws trying to tear through. I tried to ignore it, but one night I woke to find all the furniture in my room moved, chairs stacked on top of the desk, the bed pushed against the far wall. Then came the nightmares. I dreamed of the cellar, of shadowy figures reaching for me, dragging me down into the darkness. I woke up gasping, covered in sweat, the cold handprints still feeling fresh on my skin. One evening, Tom didn't show up for dinner. I went looking for him and found him in the barn, staring at a patch of ground that looked freshly disturbed. "The farm, it wants something," he whispered. "I think it's him, Samuel." That night, the house erupted in chaos. Doors banged open and shut, windows shattered without cause, and a terrible, unearthly howl filled the air. I barely escaped to the truck, heart pounding, hands trembling. The next day, we left the farm. I never went back. Years later, I learned that the Holloway farm had burned to the ground. The sheriff's report said it was a lightning strike, but those who lived nearby said they saw strange lights in the sky that night and heard screams carried on the wind. I'm certain the farm wasn't just a house. It was a prison for something ancient and hungry, something that still waits in the dark, in the shadows of old farmhouses, ready to claim the next soul foolish enough to cross its threshold. Story the end.